Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday, April 6th at a little after 1 o'clock. This is Senate Education. Many thanks to everybody for the early start. We are going to kick the day off with Ms. Rosie Kruger from the Agency of Education talking with us a little bit about S-100. For a reminder to those watching and others, that bill has been ordered to lie while the Education Committee works on looking at different funding options. We're then going to hear from the Association of Vermont Independent Colleges and the president of St. Michael's College. I suspect a similar conversation to that we had with the University of Vermont around their funding needs as it relates to federal funding coming in and perhaps an overall update. We'll then hear, then we'll really jump into hearing some of the suggestions that the House and Secretary French made. More than just suggestions now, but edits that were made to H315 that's coming back to Senate Appropriations. And then continuing along that line, S114, senators will recall this is our literacy bill. The House is really interested, as I think all of this committee, and I know Senator Kitchell in Appropriations is interested in moving this bill along as quickly as possible. They took, as we'll hear, a stab at adding their literacy bill to our literacy bill with the hopes that we will have a walkthrough on that today, take a look at what the work that they did and see our comfort level with their edits and suggestions. Some of this could be possibly worked out between the two chairs if there are suggestions that you all have going back, and it may not need to go to a committee of conference, but if it looks like it has to go to a committee of conference, we can always do a committee of conference. So with that, again, thanks for coming in early. And Ms. Kruger, as I mentioned to you before we got started, you have been in the thick of S100 around what the Agency of Education's interests and abilities are as it relates to this work. You know that we have had, and I believe Agency of Agriculture has had multiple proposals on the table. The most recent one that this committee had a walkthrough on was one that would realign eligibility, if you will, with Dr. Dinosaur, which I believe would increase the number of people that would qualify for free breakfasts and lunches. There are other ideas out there. This is something that I certainly don't want to rush and want to have you weigh in as well as your colleagues. So with that, unless you have questions, Ms. Kruger, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So for the record, Rosie Kruger, I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. And the other senators might be interested to know that Senator Hooker was my 10th grade English teacher. So not something or something I was a little bit conscious of as I was spell checking my testimony this morning.
Great.
So I did provide written testimony, just responding to some of the solutions and ideas that have been floating around in this committee over the past week or so, and responding to a few of the inquiries that I've heard from this committee about, can we do this? Can we do that? And then proposing a couple of options for you to consider that are more implementable from the agency's perspective and might be more palatable in terms of cost. So I want to kind of walk through, unfortunately, why you can't do some of the things you've been thinking about doing. These are federal programs. The National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program are federal programs implemented by the USDA. And the Agency of Education is the state agency charged with managing those programs in Vermont, but the programs have very prescriptive federal regulations. And those regulations come with a lot of funding. And so if we do stuff that the regulations say we can't do, we really risk all that federal funding. And then the burden of funding these meals really falls even more directly on the state. So I'll walk you through a couple of things that I've heard you proposing that I don't think we can do under federal regulation. And then provide some feedback on stuff that we could do, but would be difficult to implement and we don't think is the best use of resources, and then give you some ideas of what you might consider instead. So the first thing that I've heard that's a real quick answer. A couple of you have asked, why can't we just require that households submit free and reduced meal applications? Because there's this idea, which is a correct idea, that there are households out there who would qualify for free and reduced meals, but for whatever reason, they don't submit the application, and so their children aren't eligible. Therefore, the household has to pay for the meal, or we're not getting the benefit of their low income status for the purposes of other non-child nutrition programs. And there is a specific federal regulation that says that schools cannot require that households return the free and reduced meal application. We can do a lot to encourage it, but we can't require it. So that's pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, just not something we can do. If the state were to look at getting a household or using an alternative household income form for purposes other than child nutrition programs, so if you were concerned about, if we do go to a universal meals model, therefore households aren't incentivized to return those applications, and therefore our free and reduced information that we use as a proxy for all these other programs, the non-child nutrition programs, that might be negatively impacted. So if you're worried about that, the state can require that households submit a non-child nutrition program's household income form. I don't know whether that's advisable or not in terms of requiring it, simply because I think households are a little reluctant to share that information sometimes with schools. But that is something that you could require if you wanted to, but that wouldn't help the child nutrition programs. It would only help your non-child nutrition programs.
Senator Perchler.
Thank you. I had a question on that. So we can require it, but can we require it if we're doing universal meals? Because that's what I heard, that
No.
We can't require it if we're part of we are following the federal guidelines around being universal program.
You can't require the child nutrition program's application in any.
Well, no,
the household income form you can require, but that can't be used for child nutrition purposes. So if, for example, for the title programs, you wanted to know, what household income was, you could require a separate household income form.
You just can't use it to draw down the federal funds for this.
For child nutrition, yeah.
But you can draw down federal funds without filling out the form, but you have to follow their rules on universal meals or whatever they're calling it. Because those 78 schools that are doing universal meals now don't have everybody fill out that form, right?
So there's two ways, and this gets kind of into the weeds, but there's two ways under the federal programs that the schools can provide universal meals. The first way is a community eligibility provision, and that is for extremely high poverty schools, and that is where we base their free and reduced claiming rates on the number of children who are directly certified for free school meals, mostly because their households participate in 3 Squares Vermont or Reach Up. So under that program, no, we don't collect free and reduced applications at all. If the schools need student-specific data on free and reduced eligibility, then they do collect a household income form, which is separate, again, from our programs. And that form is not required, but much like the free and reduced meal application, the school asks households to submit that. If the school is participating in Provision 2, which is the universal meals option that's open to all schools, and would be generally what you're asking schools to do if you were to require all schools to participate in the school meals, in universal meals. Then the school collects the free and reduced meal application in the first year, and counts the number of counts the status of the children who actually eat in the first year. And then they don't collect applications in subsequent years, and they just apply the percentages of children who ate in the first year to the number of children who eat in subsequent years. So, there's the advantage that there's an administrative savings of not having to collect the applications in the subsequent years. And then there's also potentially an advantage in drawing down federal funds if more of the children who eat in the first year are free and reduced eligible than in the subsequent years. So basically you establish some more favorable free and reduced claiming percentages that you're then able to keep using and taking advantage of in future years. And so I believe this may have come up in this committee, the hunger advocates will often talk about this, where in that first year, the culture around school meals hasn't really changed yet. And so generally the kids who are eating in the first year are the free and reduced eligible kids more than the paid kids. And so you're able to take advantage of those claiming percentages and in subsequent years. So you are collecting the applications, but just once.
Thank you.
Any other questions on requiring the application, or I think that's pretty straightforward, unfortunately. We certainly, if there was a better way of getting those applications back, we would be doing that already.
Senator Chittenden?
So that option 2 is where I would like to understand more, and that's where I need to do some more reading, because and what I hear you saying is that you can't do it because there are federal rules, but federal rules can change. I know it literally takes an act of Congress, but if we could make it clear or get clarity as to what rule could change in order to find a path forward where we can remove the cash register from the cafeteria in Vermont schools and have the federal government contribute as much as they're currently contributing, as well as the state, finding a new path. So I don't know where you would advise me to read up on this, on what rules could change and how to advocate to Senator or Congressman Welch's office or whoever's, but I'd love to know how those rules could be changed and how we could advocate as a Senate so as to enable universal meals while still drawing down federal resources in Vermont.
Sure. So on that particular small piece about requiring the application, I actually have the federal regulation citation in my testimony. Then it's one sentence that says that the school cannot collect the application, or cannot require the application to be submitted. But I think probably what you're asking about, Senator Chittenden, is the next piece that I've heard you discussing, which is, can a school charge a one-time fee for some group of households who could afford it at the start of the school year? And in order to take advantage of the either the community eligibility provision or provision 2, which do have some advantage in terms of the administrative burden as well as in terms of the funding that's drawn down, you're not able to charge any fee at all. Those programs specifically say that meals must be provided at no charge to all students, and USDA would assume that a fee being charged for meals violated that, and so you'd be risking your ability to do that. You could theoretically still participate in the school meals programs generally and charge an upfront fee. You wouldn't be participating in one of the federal provisions, but you'd be sort of doing a non-pricing program where you actually are charging. And that's kind of USDA there's not a specific rule that contemplates this. It's not something that anybody else has done. So there's no specific prohibition on it. However, in order to cover the cost of the program, you'd probably have to charge households about $1,000 a year. And that's a pretty substantial one-time fee. And many of those households who would be charged that fee are not currently paying that because they're sending meals from home for their children. And so you would basically be saying, okay, the state is now requiring you to pay this fee, whether or not you're going to access the meals at school. And I would imagine that would be extremely unpopular. In addition, there's, the administrative burden of figuring out who are those households. Are you still going to use the free and reduced meal application to do that? Or are you setting this at some different level? And it doesn't, yeah.
Why 1,000? So why would it have to be 1,000? We're talking about putting $30 to $40 million onto the general fund or the ed fund, but now we're talking about maybe just having it cost 10 or 12 million. But couldn't we subsidize it through some creative? And I know it all gets into the weeds, and I feel like that's where we need to be on this if we really want to move this forward. But it doesn't have to be $1,000 if we're already talking about some forms of subsidies. Am I wrong on that statement?
Well, the money has to come from somewhere. So either it's going to come from the taxpayers or it's going to come from the families directly. And so that $1,000 would be if it wasn't subsidized by taxpayers. So, you can choose in there what level you'd want it to be at, but any way you slice it, somebody's going to be paying for it. There's not a magic way to make that not cost money. And you would be giving up the federal funding advantage that you get with provision 2. As well as the administrative advantages.
Senator Chittenden?
Well, I'm sorry if I'm using too much time on this, Chair Campion. Just get me straight and narrow here. But I did not hear in your presentation why pursuing any sort of subscription fee, call it whatever you want, would preclude or cancel the option 2 that you described. So that is, but I also heard you talk about this gray area that's undefined. I love gray area. Let's blaze a trail. Let's have Vermont blaze a trail on this and see if we can force some clarity in this gray space.
So the regulations around both CEP and Provision 2 say that meals have to be provided at no charge to all students. So that precludes you charging the fee at the start of the school year. USDA would consider you charging that fee to be charging for meals.
Can we get creative and charge a cafeteria access fee? And that you just can't go to the cafeteria where there is food.
I mean, frankly, as your state director of child nutrition programs, I'm pretty appalled by that idea.
Okay.
That's.
I didn't call you. I was trying to be humorous and trying to find a gray area.
Yeah. Senator Perslick.
Have we asked USAID that question? I mean, you say that they will say that, but is that just because your familiarity with the rules, or have we actually asked?
I mean, the regulations are pretty straightforward there, that meals must be provided at no charge to all students. And I have had, schools will ask, well, can we do Provision 2, but charge 50 cents per meal or that sort of thing? And that's not allowed. It doesn't meet the requirements. So I can ask USDA more about this kind of gray area if you weren't using the special provisions, but again, I wouldn't recommend doing it because you'd lose out on all the benefits of doing Provision 2 or CEP.
Right. Well, I think what we're trying to still figure out and not willing to let go of, but I get the sense we're going to probably have to, but can we have Provision 2 and you're not charging a meal, like people go in, they get a meal, nobody asks them for money, they eat the meal. So you could say that the meal is being provided at no charge. So that's the question that I'd want to ask them, is like, that we're doing it differently. Because if the goal, it depends on what USAID's goal is for saying at no charge. And that's what I don't know. So I'm not familiar with it.
I mean, it means you're not charging the household for the meal in any way.
And what's their goal for that? Why would they not want us to charge the household? What do they care?
Well, it's to increase access for meals. And I mean, it's this federal option to reduce the administrative paperwork of collecting bills and collecting free and reduced meal applications, and tracking the status of students who eat, none of which you would save by charging a fee at the start of the school year. You're potentially saving, the only thing you're saving in your scenario is the handling of cash. But at this point, most schools are using online payment systems. So children are entering their PIN numbers, or the cafeteria worker is entering the student's name in an online system, and there's no actual cash happening anyway. The system knows the status of the children, and then that generates a bill to the parents or generates a claim to us, depending on what the child's status. So there's not any, some schools do accept cash, but there's pretty nominal amounts of cash, actual cash management happening at the point of sale system. Okay. The point of sale system still, when you hear folks talk about the cash register, there's still that point of sale, and that has to happen in any of these options in order for the school food service program to verify that the child, this particular child got a meal, and this meal met the federal meal program requirements. Okay. So that's really what they're talking about removing.
Right. And so right now there's no state rule against charging me, having actually cash requirement or requiring them to have a card. So you could just give every child a card and say, meals are free for you. Here's your card, go get a meal, and then settle up with the parents later.
I mean, that's what many schools do, particularly with younger grades, but that isn't resolving, the parent is telling their child, use the school meals, don't use the school meals. The child is aware that, their parent can't afford it and they're going to get charged for it. So, we do everything we can to take what we call overt identification out of it. So, there's no, many, many years ago, there were different colored tokens or different lunch lines or that sort of thing. None of that exists anymore. And we specifically have federal regulations that prohibit overt identification of students. In many cases, the cafeteria worker who's taking the lunch counts doesn't even know the status of the child because the systems are coded. But I think you'll hear from the advocates that that's still, even though there's no overt identification, you still have the children who have money and know that they're allowed to go get a la carte items or that they can kind of charge whatever. You have those children, and then you have children who know that they can only get the school meal. And so I think the goal here is to take that out and give everybody the same meal.
Okay. Thank you. Please continue.
So I think that's some of that discussion about that fee, and I do think that charging a fee would also just add more administrative burden, wouldn't simplify things as much as you're hoping. There's also this idea about us creating a new tier of children who would be eligible, this kind of Dr. Dinosaur threshold of children between 185% of the federal poverty level, which is the current cutoff for reduced price meals. And I should note, I think you all are aware, the state pays the student's share of the reduced price meals. So we talk about free and reduced meals in Vermont, but all those meals are free to the household. The state just pays the 40 cents for the reduced price lunch and the 30 cents for the reduced price breakfast. So this would create a new tier between 185% of federal poverty, and I think that the Dr. Dinosaur threshold was 317% of federal poverty level, and that would be paid for by the state. I wouldn't recommend this option either, and basically, it's still fairly expensive. You've heard from JFO that it's about $12 million. Doesn't get you any of the advantages of universal meals. You're still have some kids who can access the free meals and some kids who have to pay for meals, and that kind of disparity that we were just talking about. It's just at a different threshold. You still have administrative burden of processing applications every year, of tracking the children who eat, of collecting bills from some parents. So you don't save any of that. And actually you complicate that further. And the reason that you complicate it further is because right now these three categories, free, reduced, and paid, are the same categories that everybody else uses across the country. They're the federal categories for school meals. And all of the vast majority of our schools use these off-the-shelf computer systems to process applications, to track student status, to do that point of sale. And all of those systems that are nationally available off-the-shelf systems would need to then be modified to have this Vermont-specific category so that the schools could count and claim those meals. And so that modification, of course, is going to come with a cost. So all those schools are going to have to pay their vendors to create this new category. The state is going to have to collect this new category. So we're going to have to change our system. We're going to have to provide a whole bunch of new training to the approving officials who approve the free and reduced meal applications about how to manage this category. And then, so administratively, actually more complex than your current system because we're doing all that. And then it also adds this huge level of confusion for households. And that's because that free and reduced eligibility status is used for a lot of other things. So right now with COVID, we're seeing that children in households who are eligible for free and reduced meals or whose children attend Provision 2 or CEP schools, those children are eligible for pandemic EBT benefits, which is an electronic benefit card that can be used much like 3 Squares Vermont. And those children will be eligible very shortly for an emergency broadband benefit. But we have a lot of other things, non-COVID benefits like that as well. For example, waived SAT fees for children in that category. And if we were to add this Vermont only category, there would be a lot of confusion from those households about whether they were eligible. And there would be confusion at the school level. And we'd have to do a lot more explaining to these households that, yeah, you're eligible for Vermont free meals, but you're not eligible for PEBT. You're not eligible for this emergency broadband benefit. You're not eligible for waived SAT fees. And I can imagine a lot of confusion happening at that level, with the reporting that schools do back up to the state about these different income thresholds. So you're making things more complicated. You're not getting any of the benefits of universal meals, and you're still costing $12 million a year. So I would really urge you to not invest in that idea.
I think,
so I know,
you know, I just want to mention, I think the idea itself came, the proposal was put forward in good faith to work to address food and nutrition for those students most in need in the state, you know, and I think in that I very much appreciate, you know, recognizing that, you know, it would be an awful lot. It's a big step to go universal, but I thought it was an interesting idea, and I hear your concerns, and I'll leave it to the committee to whether or not how we might want to work with those concerns or not, but appreciate that feedback. Looking at time, and we do have our witnesses have here arrived. I'm going to try to get done with this in about 10 minutes altogether, if possible. So I think
Sure.
Now we're moving on to what might work.
Yeah. So I know I just gave you a whole bunch of negative news about how all the things you've thought really carefully about. And I really appreciate your spending all the time to think about what all our options could be, how we don't recommend any of those options. But I am presenting you with two options that you could consider if you want to move in this direction of universal meals, but you don't feel like you can commit the full amount. And I will say, you know, we had worked with Senate Ag a lot to make the version of the bill that they introduced implementable. The agency still had concerns about that from a cost perspective, but the version that they were working on was something that we could implement. And so, but if you feel like, you know, you can't come up with the funding for that, which seems to be the discussion right now, and the agency would agree with that there's some pretty significant cost concerns with going to full universal meals. An option to consider is doing universal breakfast only. So universal breakfast only comes with a significantly lower price tag. JFO has estimated between $6 and $10 million per year. You get a lot of the benefits of universal meals with universal breakfast only because you are removing the cost and the administrative burden for that one meal. So the schools can do a lot more creative stuff with offering meals in the classroom, offering grab and go meals, and they're not having to track the status of each child who's eating. So that kind of makes things a little bit more streamlined. We've heard from schools that have moved to universal meals about how breakfast particularly can be a really communal meal that everybody's eating together in the classroom, allows teachers that time to check in with students. You get a lot of the attendance benefits that you would get from universal meals. So kids show up to school on time more because they know they're getting breakfast, so there's an incentive. And two, there's not that rushing around at home trying to get breakfast together. In terms of your concerns about, you know, are we spending a lot of state taxpayer money on families who don't need it? I think universal breakfast is a little bit more palatable there because generally you'll find that the kids who are taking advantage of it are the less affluent households. The more affluent households still are mostly probably going to provide meals for their children at home, but they will appreciate, you know, on that day that things are just a mess at home when you're running out the door. Oh, the kid can eat at school. I don't have to send money. No big deal. And that is what kind of helps that school culture of anybody can grab a meal if they need it that day. So again, a lot of benefits there. And I think that, you know, you'd find that likely you'd have a lot of the benefits about behavior as well, because the kids are starting the day well fed. Although I don't have the stats on that, the advocates might. And again, at a much lower cost. Another reason that the agency likes this idea is that it has no impact on your free and reduced data. So I think you've heard a little bit from us about our concerns about moving to universal meals because you disincentivize households from returning the free and reduced meal application. And then that impacts that data that we use for a lot of other stuff. And in this case, you're still collecting those applications for lunch. And so there's no impact on that data. So it's very implementable. There is still some state level monitoring that's required. So I do still need that additional child nutrition position that was in the original bill in order to implement this. But with that position, we could implement that this fall. So that gives you a quicker timeline to getting something implemented. And so overall, I think that this is a pretty good option for you with a lower price tag. I want to stop there and see if you've got questions about that, and then I can give you the final option that we're suggesting.
Oh, Senator Lyons, please.
Yeah, no, how many schools currently are doing this, have the breakfast?
I should have that stat for you, and I don't. We do have maybe 10 or 20, something like that.
So only, but so
in addition to those 70 or so who are doing both breakfast and lunch.
okay, so it's a higher number overall. So it would be 80 or 90 maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe that the JFO calculation takes that into account, although I can't speak to them about how much they included. But it's a lot cheaper because breakfast is a cheaper meal. So it ends up being about $1.85 if you were to do it this year. Sorry, $1.85. No, $1.59 would be the difference between the paid and paid and free federal reimbursement that you would be making up this year, $1.59 per meal.
Maybe we just make it a cheaper lunch and still meet USDA guidelines.
That would be pretty tough. So, and we do have this federal requirement that if you are doing the special provisions, and this is in my written testimony, but I didn't really go into it today, but there's a requirement that you make up the cost differential between the paid, basically the amount that the paid household would have had to pay. That has to be paid out of non-federal funds when you go to provision 2. And so that's where either it's going to be local money or state money, but really it's sort of coming from the same place. So the last option here I've given you, and I always throw this out whenever I hear folks asking, how can we improve or help school meals programs? If you have some amount of money that you want to put towards these programs, but you don't have the full amount, the easiest way for us to distribute additional money, and there's literally no additional administrative burden to the agency or the schools to do this, is to increase the state match funding. And state match is a little bit of a misnomer. So we are required by the feds to pay out about just under $500,000 per year for the benefit of our school meals programs. And the way that we do that in Vermont is we pay out the legislature appropriates us this amount, and we divide it up among the schools based on the number of breakfasts and lunches served between July and December each year. And so last year, that amount you did in 2020, you did $437,000 for lunch and $132,000 for breakfast. That amounted to about 14 cents per lunch that was served and 11 cents per breakfast that was served. You increased that amount by $75,000 for lunch over prior years, but prior to that, the amount had stayed the same since 2016 when it was cut. And before that, it had not been increased since 2007. So the problem here is that we've been, serving more meals. And so the more meals we serve, the less state match per meal the schools get. And so, if you wanted to put $10,000 more in here, that would go out to the schools equitably. And with, any amount of money, they would use that to improve their programs. If it's a large amount of money, I would see some of them deciding that's enough money for them to make the local decision to switch to universal meals. If it's a smaller amount of money, they might use it for things like local food purchasing. They might use it to increase benefits for, pay and benefits for the food service staff, who are some of the lowest paid employees in the school. They might use it to increase meal quality, or they might use it to reduce the amount of local funds that are that have to be used to make up for the deficit in the school food service account.
But it
So
would have to be used for food or food service.
It would need to be used for, it goes to the nonprofit school food service account. So it is used for the food service program. It can't leave that account.
Okay.
But they then decide what their local needs are for their food service program, and they all have needs. So this is something I recommend if you've got a lesser amount of money that you want to put into the programs, because again, there is no administrative burden to distributing the funding that way. And that's what I have for you. So I'm happy to answer your questions, and help you figure out what makes sense here.
Senator Perslick.
Thank you. Ms. Kruger, does AOE have a position? This is very helpful. Thank you for this information. But it seemed like you're providing some suggestions, but do I take that the AOE is not taking a position one way or the other?
So we're definitely taking a position against some of these other options.
Right. No.
In terms of universal breakfast, that would be our preference over some of the other options. We still do have some concerns about the impact on property taxes. And that's probably true of any increase in funding, just because that's a concern. But if you are going to go down this path and appropriate more money for this purpose, this is the best way from our perspective for you to do that. And this would be the best use of those dollars.
Okay. Does AOE have a preference whether it be, or are there any complications, whether it's like the off the top option where it's just paid by the state versus a part of the district's voted on budgets?
We haven't taken a strong position on that. I think we do believe that the concerns raised by the superintendents that it's basically, an unfunded mandate that that they have to put in their budgets and could cause their budgets to be voted down. Those are valid concerns. And so I can tell you that we could figure out, and we've talked to our payment vendor, and this is something that they could do. We can figure out how to pay them out a flat per meal rate for that difference between the free and paid meals. We can do that without a lot of additional cost from our vendor. So that's not a particularly big deal to do that at the state level from an administrative perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Kruger, that was Senator Hooker, please.
Just following up on that last question. So we've heard that it would be difficult to expand to Dr. Dinosaur. We've heard that it would be difficult to take this off the top of the ed fund.
I'm not sure that we would tell you that it's difficult to take it off the top of the ed fund.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Terrific testimony, very helpful in terms of clarifying where we're at and some of the possibilities of where we might go. So I appreciate it, and we'll likely have you in again as we work with our friends in agriculture and appropriations. So thanks very much.
I appreciate the opportunity. I just really want to make sure that whatever you do pass out of the committee is something that I can easily implement. So I'm happy to work with you on that. No,
I appreciate that very much. And we will be looking for if we do notice any errors whatsoever grammatically,
I'll get a redlined version back, I'm sure.
I'll have to pull your A.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kruger. Good to see you. Ms. Steitley and President Sterrett, thanks for joining us this afternoon in Senate Education. President Sterrett, we sat next to one another a while ago at a conference on higher education. So it's nice to see you again. And Ms. Steitley, it's always good to see you.
Very nice to see you. And I met some of you at the inauguration of the UVM president. So it's nice to see you all again.
Yes. So committee, just a reminder, we've asked Ms. Steitley and President Sterrett here to talk a little bit about COVID relief funding. We know we've heard from our friends at the University of Vermont. We also know our independent colleges and universities are also having their own unique struggles, and looking to hear from both of them. And so with that, the floor is yours. I don't know who is going to be the ship, if you will. Is it you, Ms. Steitley?
Yes, I'll get started. Thank you, Chair Campion, for having us today, and committee. It's nice to see you all again. I am just going to briefly go over the total impact for all the private colleges, the economic impact, and then I will turn it over to President Steeritt so that you have an on-the-ground perspective of what it's actually like for the colleges. So I would like to start, if Jeannie could get up the spreadsheet that I sent. And first, I do want to say we very much appreciate the 10 million that you gave us last session. It was very, very helpful. However, it only meant a portion of our needs. And the spreadsheet will show you that our actual losses and expenses are much, much higher. So,
Susan, I've made you co-host so you can post it from your computer.
Unfortunately, I do not know how to do that.
Okay, well, it'll take me a bit to get it up.
Okay, because yes, I'd have to. I've actually never had to do that. So I'll just sort of give you a brief overview until we get it up. What we did with this was show the lost revenue from the COVID impact beginning on March 13th, 2020, and then projecting out for the next 4 years. So we started with lost room and board, and part of that was refunds in 2020. In FY21, we had significantly less students than anticipated. Many, of course, stayed at home because of the pandemic. So that loss of students in the fall of 2020 will continue over the next 4 years. So there's going to be continue to be loss in room and board, and continue to be reduced tuition due to enrollment declines. The impact for that, as we see when we get that up there, is greatest this year for the total lost revenues. We also have event center and summer program losses. Last year, everything was canceled. This year, there's still going to be a significant reduction. It's just not yet safe. We don't know how many people will be vaccinated when to continue with many of the events that we would normally have. Some summer programs will be continuing, but again, there'll be great losses in that area as well. There's some losses in unpaid student accounts. Again, tuition decline, and then disruption in food services, bookstores, dorm services, cafeteria losses. So I'll just do this year and then the overall impact. Great, there, looks like it's up. So I am in that first section there where it says lost revenue, COVID impact. And I just sort of went through each of those categories, and you'll see that the lost revenue for FY21 is 121.6 million. And then projecting out over the next 4 years, it's 197.9 million. Then, of course, we have the expenses that have been significant, and we don't still have a good idea of how long the financial impact of the pandemic will last, as it's a race between vaccines and variants. And we don't know yet what next term will look like. We're certainly hoping all the students will be vaccinated. Even then, we've already had an experience with a student who's been fully vaccinated and has tested positive. So that has ramifications for the whole community. So we may have to continue testing into next year as well. So just looking at this section on COVID expenses, there's been the isolation and quarantine, which has required food services, dorms set aside, and mental health. The students are getting very distressed and anxious. So mental health needs have increased, and there's more students who are on sort of a suicide watch. So we really are trying to be careful to support the students. So that's been a big expense. And then for technology and going online and hybrid classes, there's had to be software training for faculty and staff and purchases to make that all happen smoothly. And I think the colleges have done a great job in making hybrid classes interesting to the students, but that still is a challenge. And then there's all the COVID relief healthcare costs, the PPE, the tents that were necessary, the sanitation, air quality, dorm conversion, and finally testing. So for this year, those expenses are 16.6 million, and over the next 4 years, it's the greatest expense this year. It'll end up being around 29.3 million. So our total COVID impact this year is 138.2 million, and over 4 years, 227.3 million. Then I wanted you to see what we have gotten in COVID grant revenue. And that's the last section where we did get money from the federal government, HERFA 1, and to help with last year's expenses and some into FY21. Then we have the 10 million that we received from the state. We did get a Vermont testing grant that covered the fall. And 3 institutions did get a Vermont Economic Recovery grant. That was, I believe, St. Mike's, Champlain, and SIT. And then we have the next 2 rounds of federal money that will hopefully all be coming in. So if you look at the very, very final line in yellow, the net COVID impact, once you take out the grant revenue, for this year, 2021, it's 90.4 million, and then over 4 years, 174 million. And as you know, I don't need to go over the details again. The colleges are employers where they're located, and we really need to keep full employment there to help stimulate the economy. So only by meeting as much need as we can, it will help us not have further layoffs or pay freezes or employment freezes or reduction to entire retirement benefits. So we're really asking your support in reaching out to House Appropriations. Of course, we'd like to have the full impact, but no, that's probably not realistic. But if half the need could be met, that would be a big help to our institutions and help keep them on solid ground and moving forward. So now I'd like to turn it over to Lorraine to tell you about what it's really like as the president of a college.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
And before you start, if you wouldn't mind, are you finished with the screen now, Susan?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. So Jeannie, if you wouldn't mind also just emailing that document to all of us and putting it on our website. President Sterrett.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you. And Susan has summed up the situation very eloquently. So I will add some local flavor to it from here at St. Michael's. And thank you also for all the support that you have given us to date. We really appreciate that. I would say that the impact of the pandemic on St. Michael's has been very dramatic on multiple fronts. I think the technical term might well be that COVID has taken a sledgehammer to a college. When we look at undergraduate enrollment, for example, first year enrollment was down almost 5% this year over last year. Then COVID safety measures, of course, helped the students to feel secure and safe being here. But many were still uncertain about starting college in the conditions of the pandemic or leaving home during the pandemic. That was very nerve-wracking, both for students and their families. And then as the time of the pandemic lengthened some more, students decided to step away. So St. Michael's enrollment went down 2.5% from fall 2019 to fall 2020. And then spring to spring, we were down over 6%. That issue is exacerbated financially by some students, understandably, deciding to study fully remotely. We gave them that option. And over 12% of our students are fully remote. From a financial point of view, since I always have one eye on the finances and often two eyes on the finances, that means that they're paying tuition only and not room and board. So that is a hit for us. And previously it had not been an option to study fully remotely, but of course during the pandemic that was an option. Very hard to predict the long-term impact of that. Then, like many of our peer institutions, we are very concerned about the first year class for this fall, the fall of 2021. Every indication is that the numbers will be very significantly impacted by the pandemic. And obviously, you know, there are elite schools with big names and they will not be impacted, but most colleges like us, respectable institutions nationwide, and many of our Vermont peers really saw a fall in applications, and that's very concerning. So why is that happening? The factors, of course, include our inability to offer campus tours because of understandable COVID restrictions, and also families' inability to visit. We often find at St. Michael's, so as soon as people set foot on our campus, they're smitten and they come here. So when that's not possible, that has a real impact. Also, high school students didn't have as much access to guidance counselors. And it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, family financial circumstances changed a great deal due to job loss. So college was just not on the horizon for some families. Also, families directed their attention and their support into how to survive the pandemic on multiple fronts. So it's very difficult to predict exactly what a return to normality will look like. The financial impact we know for certain will linger for Vermont colleges for the foreseeable future. And then when we look at summer enrollments, summer enrollment is down 13% from the summer of 2019 to the summer of 2020. And at this point, it's too early to know what the summer of 2021 will look like. And then, of course, recruitment of new students is only one piece of the enrollment picture. The other side of that coin is the question of retention. And retention during a period of uncertainty is a point of real concern, and one that the college cannot clearly predict, obviously, from one month to the next, given the unprecedented circumstances. But of our somewhat smaller class this year, more than 10% are fully remote, and that has an impact on retention because it means obviously that they're not here in person having the full St. Michael's experience. We're, I think, pretty well known for being a very warm and friendly campus, and when you're fully remote, you don't get all of that. And so that has an impact on their ability to integrate into the culture in a very substantial way. At our best, and this is a real point of pride for us in relation to comparable schools, 15% of our students leave after the first year. So an increase in that percentage due to the pandemic would have a very significant impact on our bottom line. And then beyond the first year, students, I think it's safe to say, are facing COVID fatigue. And they are really weary. They at some level understand the governor's requirements, and then we've been very careful to say that the governor has put these requirements in place for good reason, but the students are tired of it. And they're also facing an uncertain job market, family-related stress, and other family-related needs. So we hope that we will be able to continue at comparable retention rates, but it's a very big unknown for us at this point. And of course, there's light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines on the horizon, and the vaccines opening up on April 19th for college-age students. I think that will help a lot. So just as smaller initial enrollments affect colleges of our size over a period of years, as Susan said, you know, when you enroll a small class, you have that small class for 4 years, and you have the budgetary impact of that for 4 years. So too do fluctuations in retention affect more than just one immediate fiscal year. Our CFO, Rob Robinson, has a phrase that he likes to use every time we say, well, what will this look like and what will that look like? He will say, your crystal ball is as good as mine. So the long-term impact is very difficult to predict, and yet we know that it is very real. And we are bound and determined to continue to serve our students, but we really need help. We serve students from Vermont, and also students from out of state. And many of our students go on to positions of prominence as future leaders in Vermont business and in the community at large. I mean, if you look at the list of our alums, Senator Patrick Leahy, General Joseph Dunford, Lindsay Curley, Ted Brady, Richard Tarrant, Pat Robbins, Gary Farrell, what do they all have in common? They're all graduates of St. Michael's College. They may have other things in common too, but they're all graduates of St. Michael's. So we really pride ourselves in putting to great use the education that we provide in terms of educating leaders and civic leaders and business people in the community. But to be candid, we need help. We need support to maintain this legacy and to maintain predictable and fluid levels of service and education until COVID is fully assessed and the impact is fully known and the situation has stabilized and well beyond. How long will that take? Hard to say. It could take years. It will certainly take semesters to come. And then on the graduate enrollment front, we only have a few graduate programs at St. Michael's. We have graduate programs in education and psychology and English as a foreign language. So we only have a few, but I think they are well known and very well respected, and they serve many Vermont adults. So the impact on graduate enrollment has also been severe. Comparing fall 2019 to fall 2020, the enrollments were down over 35%. And then spring 2021 has increased by 10% from fall 2020. Summer 2020 enrollments were down 25% from the summer of 2019. And so this also has an impact. And our graduate programs are strong, as I say, but the trends don't always map to industry as a whole. So we don't want to extrapolate for all schools by any means. I would say with regard to education programs, for example, when teachers feel stressed, our graduate program in education serves a really important purpose. But when all teachers are feeling stressed, as they currently are, they may not feel that they have the time or the bandwidth to add classes on top of their workload already. So our programs suffer from that. So all of the above leads me to the overall financial impact. What has the overall financial impact been on St. Michael's, and what do we know? In short, I would say that our CFO summarizes the financial impact as follows. He would say that to date, St. Michael's has had $10.8 million of impact. And that is cumulative of refunds, because last semester we refunded room and board, which is a huge hit for us. Cumulative of refunds, lost revenue, and additional expenses. For a school of this size, we're a small, not wealthy private college. This is huge. A loss of that magnitude, $10.8 million. We have received $3.4 million in grants. That of course is a help, but 10.8 is a very, very significant number for a school of this size. We refunded over $3 million in room and board at the beginning of the pandemic last year when we evacuated the campus that famous day, Friday, March 13th, and we are still dealing with those losses. And then continued revenue decline related to decline in enrollments is estimated at $1.5 million and counting. There's also the costs of attending to COVID-related healthcare matters, as Susan mentioned. And at St. Michael's, we have put over $500,000 into that. So that is also very significant for us. And the revenues from non-academic on-campus events that took place in the pre-COVID era and that would have been estimated as bringing in $2 million, again, huge loss for us. And so I think it's important to point out that the losses go well beyond simply the tuition and residence fees, and that they are very severely felt. A few other considerations. Technology has certainly made continuing safely in the pandemic a possibility, and we're very grateful for that. I don't know where we would have been without Zoom. That's a tremendous help to higher education and gives us tremendous flexibility. And while there are some efficiencies in teaching with technology, obviously, there are also many costs. And so St. Michael's has invested $140,000 in technology costs in FY20 and FY21 so far for the transition to online learning. A fraction of that will continue going forward, and we have certainly learned from it. We've gained many skills as an institution, and there are things that we may continue to do. I've been doing fundraising by Zoom, for example, and whoever thought that could work, but it does work. I landed a $75,000 gift the other day via Zoom, someone I've only met on Zoom. So there are certainly things that we have learned and will take forward from that, but it's been very expensive. Also, I would say our Vermont location is an attraction for many students. It can also be a challenge. We all are familiar with the demographics here that are working against colleges. It can be a challenge for those who don't want this location because of the weather and perceived smallness. We don't agree with that, but 18-year-olds have their own yardsticks for measuring their choice of college. So I would have to say that we're very grateful for all that the state has done with public agencies and private business to promote Vermont as a great place to live and to work and to study. That really helps us. And so I think the more success for the state means the more success for colleges and vice versa. I would also say that our great success in mitigating COVID has been excellent for our students and our employees. We've been pretty strict in the protocols for handling COVID, and that has paid off. But that the burden of that success is wearing on young people. And to be perfectly honest, I think it would be incorrect to say that all students and families felt that the decision to attend college under such restrictions was actually worth it. Many of them absolutely would say so, and they begged us to remain open because they did not want to go home to their parents, frankly. But they absolutely wanted to be here, and we very much appreciate that. But it's been tough. It's definitely been a tough year. I think especially with all the changes and the unpredictability of the whole thing, which is nobody's fault. There was no way to predict what the virus would do from one day to the next. So I would sum up by saying that the support from federal and state allocations has been very helpful, but our losses have also been very, very significant. And for a small nonprofit, that is devastating. And so our business model is really challenged to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. And we fully expect that will continue for some time. We're optimistic about the future, but we're also realistic about what it's going to take to manage that pathway back to some semblance of normality. We do see that return coming, but like many other industries, we're also suffering from that lost revenue and from the opportunities that the pandemic stole from us. And so our ability to sustain our operations successfully really requires assistance. And we're hoping that will be a message that is heard. I think that the state and the country has asked a lot of students and employees, and in the case of Vermont, has asked a lot of student and employees in order to keep the state healthy, and from a medical point of view and also from an economic point of view, and we've been very happy to do our part. So we really appreciate anything that the state and the federal governments are able to do for us as we continue to really make our campuses safe and to continue to be functioning communities. So I thank you for listening and for assisting us in this crucial endeavor of educating future leaders for the great state of Vermont. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Starrett. So did an appropriation make its way through the House and is now in Senate Appropriations? Is there a request on the table?
There is a request on the table, but it's in House Appropriations still.
I see. It's in House Appropriations. Great. So I think this committee would really appreciate seeing the request, either now or maybe not at this moment, but whatever, I think, Senate Appropriations is going to ask us what we think. And so without any numbers, unless I miss them, we have nothing from which to respond. So
I'll get that to you.
okay, that would be terrific. Great. Any questions for either Ms. Steitley or President Sterrett? Senator Hooker.
Thank you. President Steitley, do you have plans for continuing remote learning, remote courses, or will there be kind of a stop of allowing students to take the majority of their courses online? I'm just curious. I know your crystal ball doesn't tell you when the pandemic is going to end, but is there any thought about getting kids back on campus by limiting the amount of online learning?
Yeah, our hope is that we will be back to normal in the fall. For us is the end of August. So if folks are vaccinated in July, we're optimistic. Obviously depending on the variants and the speed with which the vaccine continues to roll out, but we're optimistic that we would be back to normal in the fall with in-person classes and in-person science labs all functioning as usual. That said, in the course of all of this, some of the silver lining has been that we have seen real opportunities in online learning. So we have contracted with 2 agencies to offer online courses, something called the low-cost model, which I don't like the title of it, and also the CIC model, which are online platforms with real college courses, not some pre-packaged thing that you find by Googling it, but real courses with real professors, and colleges get together in groups, which I think is one of the pathways forward for small colleges actually, is to get together in groups and share resources. And so I think the silver lining is that this has really opened up our eyes to possibilities there. For us, I think that will always be supplementary. We are a residential college, and our students love that. When we first sent them home last year, we were afraid that, they'll get so used to online learning that they won't want to come back. Actually, the opposite was the case. They were clamoring to come back. So our identity is a residential college, but I think we absolutely have opportunities that we're already availing ourselves of to build around that.
Okay, thank you.
Terrific. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so Ms. Steitley, if you would email us the document. I could be wrong, but I thought Approps was already in the Senate doing this kind of work. So if you could get that to us this week, that would be terrific, and that would give everybody an opportunity to review that.
Yes, I will get that to you quickly.
Okay.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Great to see both of you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. Committee, let's just take a 5-minute break, quick stretch, get a little sun. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Senate Education. We have with us Secretary of Education, Dan French, and Counsel for the Agency of Education, Emily Simmons. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for all that the 2 of you are doing as well, Secretary French, your agency. We know everyone is working incredibly hard. Your staff continues to be very helpful to us as we making themselves available as we navigate a number of things on a number of fronts. So thank you for that. I've asked Secretary French and Ms. Simmons to come in just to take us through H315, reminding senators H315, I continue to refer to it as the expedited budget, started in the House. We made a number of different suggestions and changes, went back to the House, and the Secretary as well as others weighed in on different things. So I thought we might have a conversation just so everyone is up to speed as to where we are at this point. So with that, Mr. Secretary and Ms. Simmons, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Emily Simmons, our General Counsel at the Agency of Education. We have 40 minutes, so happy to use that as productively as you see fit. I think it's fair to say it did go back and forth, H315. We sort of intercepted the ball, if you will, at one point, particularly as we became increasingly concerned about essentially trying to encumber 3 years worth of emergency funding in a matter of weeks. And as we were working with districts to do their needs assessment and embark on the recovery planning, it increasingly became of interest to us that we wanted to get involved in the process, and just to alert you from our perspective that things were moving very rapidly. So we tried to get involved also as the technical experts on the use of ESSER funds, which I think you're all familiar with now. In particular, there was interest in using the ESSER state set-aside funds. So in our conversations directly with the policy committee, the House Ed committee, we embarked on a fairly intensive period of work last week, and Emily was directly involved in that. Basically to try to thread a needle, if you will, to listen to that committee's priorities, but also to look at H315, the amendments that your committee had in the Senate had brought over to that, and try to bring that together in a way that would sort of satisfy ESSER and also support the recovery work at districts, but also acknowledge the priorities of the General Assembly. So I've provided written testimony. I'm not going to speak to it today. I just more or less point you to it as a reference point, because that what I just described to you, that threading the needle process, essentially a very intensive 2-day period midweek last week, is what came out of that document that I provided to you. And I will say during those, I think 2.5 days worth of work, House Appropriations also had a representative in the room. So that was, I think, a key part of that process. And I know they've made some progress. I know, I believe Emily's tracked this a little more closely as to what the House has done with this since then. But again, I think this document just provides sort of a good artifact for you as to how, when we mashed all these things up, what was sort of the output that we presented to the committee, then the committee took that from there. But maybe, Emily, if you could just give us a quick update as to where the House is at with this work.
And just to
Certainly.
clarify, Mr. Secretary, the document, when senators jump into it, these were, again, the recommendations. This is not where folks landed necessarily.
That's correct. This was our testimony that we presented. We were tasked with a very specific, let's say in a collaborative process, but we were asked to sort of try to bring the technical side, the legal piece of it together with what were essentially 3 policy priorities from that committee. And also to, just in the moment of time, trying to bring that down to a place that gave them an actionable work product. But this is not what they ultimately produced. This was sort of how we landed on it. But Emily can sort of
clarify that for the committee, because I know Representative Webb and I had many a conversation last week trying to get to a good landing. So with that, Ms. Simmons.
Sure. So the majority of the work that the other body did in their amendment was taking ESSER appropriations out, and those were taken out at the agency's suggestion. So rather than get into the details, I'll start with telling you what remains. What remains is an influx of funds to the existing indoor air quality program, a new grant for after school program, support for after school and summer learning, and summer meals.
There pause there for a moment. Sorry, on the after school. So I know that we asked for $4 million to go to DCF. In the end, after talking with Representatives Hooper and Webb, Senator Kitchell and I decided to do the 50-50 split, 50% to AOE, 50% to DCF, and then there was a change there. Could you just say a little bit about the details of where all that landed?
Absolutely. There was in the Senate amendment a transfer, an appropriation to the Agency of Education that we were directed to transfer to the Department of Children and Families. It was our analysis of ESSER that told us a transfer like that is inappropriate. We are charged at the Agency of Education with oversight of these funds. Secretary French signs the assurances for these funds. So when grants are made, they are more properly from our agency. And so what you see is hopefully accomplishing the same goals, but going through an ESSER compliant channel. So the House did pass a $4 million appropriation for the after school and summer programs. It all goes to the Agency of Education. Within the $4 million, $2 million of that is directed to be made or to grant in consultation between AOE and DCF.
Yeah, the challenging piece there was the use of the phrase transfer. Again, part of our task was to sort of vet what was being proposed against sort of the technical requirements of ESSER.
So we should feel comfortable that the DCF will have $2 million that to work on some of these programs.
I think a reasonable accommodation was achieved that is also compliant with federal regulation. So,
okay. So I'm sorry, just to clarify. So DCF gets 2 million still.
We will subgrant to them as opposed to transfer.
Okay. Okay.
And
go ahead.
If I could put a really fine point on it, the
Yes,
appropriation is from ESSER funds to the Agency of Education. The purpose for the full $4 million is to be used for grants to after school and summer programs. For $2 million of the $4 million, the grants are to be made in consultation and approval of DCF.
Okay. I know there was some final back and forth there, but that sounds like a good spot to be. Okay.
Right. It means that all $4 million will go to programs that are directly serving kids.
Okay. Thank you. Please continue. You were moving on. I don't remember. We had done air quality, this, and there was another one.
Summer meals.
Please.
So the language about summer meals is unchanged from the Senate proposal of amendment. It's non-ESSER funds supplementing the summer meals program in a direction to prioritize the use of FEMA funds if possible. There's a little bit of a moving target, and the secretary can speak to this too. The goal is to make the most strategic use of funds, but it's clear that the use is to make sure that students and families have access to nutritious foods in the summer. And that's, again, 5.5 million.
Yeah, and our work with the House Ed Committee, because this wasn't attached directly to ESSER, it was a little easier for us to sort of work through that pretty quickly. Relatively speaking, as Emily alluded to, we did want to retain sort of the maximum flexibility to potentially draw FEMA into play. But this was originally back in January part of a plan to allocate unused CRF funds, the coronavirus relief funds. And we, that was a strategy that the General Assembly had strategized or created before under the CRF appropriations in August.
Thank you. Any questions so far? Okay. Would you mind saying something about, I'm happy to say it if you don't want, but I thought it'd be helpful coming from the two of you, where we landed with literacy dollars.
Yeah, I think literacy is an example, and I was going to bring up school facilities when we were engaging sort of again in a sort of intensive period of 2 days, 2.5 days. We started, part of that conversation started with an understanding of what the committee's priorities were, and not necessarily this committee's priorities, but we had spent quite a bit of time, as we have with you, trying to understand what their priorities were. And literacy was an example of one. A priority that we had brought, the Agency of Education had brought to the table a year ago at least, and similarly with facilities. And they had made some progress on that. So we still have literacy in play, if you will, from a policy perspective, but it's not directly attached to ESSER at this point. So the practical work of last week was really around how to use ESSER funds and the mechanics around that. We fully expect literacy to emerge as a priority for school districts, but right now it's not being attached to statewide ESSER funds. Facilities, I can talk about in a minute, but why don't I pause there on literacy, see if Emily has anything to add.
It's our understanding, and I would love to be corrected if this is not right, that there are differences between your committee and the other body's approach to the literacy bill, but that when the policy approach is ironed out, the use of ESSER funds will be re-examined to serve for any funding needs that are in that final version of the legislation. And our testimony last week in the other body demonstrates that there's a way that's appropriate to utilize the ESSER funds for that kind of work. But as the secretary's been saying, it's a threading the needle type exercise to use the almost magic ESSER words to make sure that the use of funds would be seen as appropriate for these federal programs. But we believe it's doable.
Yeah.
And we'd be happy to provide the technical assistance when you get to that stage.
That would be helpful. The way Senator Kitchell and I left it with Representatives Hooper and Webb was, we're going to take a look today at S14. That is now a merged bill between the two literacy policy positions, if you will. We know that they use some of our language. We used a bit of theirs, and it sounds like we might be getting to a middle ground. If we can get to a middle ground sooner rather than later, I believe that's the hope of both bodies. And then an appropriation will be navigated after that, either using ESSER funds, or it may end up in the big bill, something along those lines. But I believe it's the priority of all four committees to advance this year still. And I know it's yours as well. So thank you for that. And certainly any technical language you can help us with would be most appreciated as we get there.
Yeah, to Emily's point, I mean, as you know, last week we were very focused on trying to, get 315 to move for the committee, and because there wasn't necessarily policy consensus in the area of literacy, more or less the committee just sort of set it aside and worked on the other issues they could advance.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, one thing that you might want to always, if you want to jot this down, Secretary French, you can always tell the House that they can simply concur.
I'll pass that along.
If you want to use that line at any point.
Yeah. They gave me some other message to convey to you, but I lost it between here and the other committee room.
As the Secretary's Counsel, I have to ask, do you need to be credited for that statement, Mr. Chair?
No, I do not.
For use without attribution.
Right.
No, I will. It is fair to say it's relatively easy to work through some of these issues when there's broad consensus that they should be a priority. And I think literacy is one of those. I think facilities is another one. Again, where we interjected ourselves more energetically last week because we were asked to become more directly involved was on the sort of the technical concerns of the ESSER program itself. Once that it became apparent to us that was being identified as a specific funding source. There are technical aspects to managing those funds that have to be considered. They're a little different than CRF. But again, I fully expect if there's interest to move on literacy, we'd be happy to do that last piece and just make sure it complies with the magical language as Emily referred to it, if ESSER's tagged as a funding source.
Great, thank you for that.
I was going to mention facilities a bit. Facilities, almost very similar conversation. And I believe I'm scheduled to come discuss tomorrow H426. Which is the school construction bill. Again, an example of a policy idea that's been on the table for at least a year, if not longer. And last year, I think we were trying to make some progress on doing a study statewide, essentially an inventory of the conditions of schools. And what emerged this year with COVID, as I said to the committee when I testified on 426. Pretty much everything we're looking at now through the lens of COVID. In particular, there's potentially some significant federal dollars coming into play to address school facilities issues. So we, in the context of looking at 315 and facilities, they more or less set that aside for the moment, knowing that there was a school construction policy conversation happening, and this intersection between what I'll call deferred maintenance and construction. The two aren't the same necessarily, but I throw into the bigger pot around the conversation of school facilities improvement is a policy conversation. I think we'll have more tomorrow, but it was one, again, that was included in the written document I provided today because it was one of their priorities, and we wanted to make sure anything they had identified as sort of the big three priorities. That was some of our tasking that went on one day. They said, make sure you address these three priorities when you come back. It clearly was sort of set aside as part of the 315 conversation because it doesn't necessarily belong in there, but it does belong on the table relative to use of federal dollars. So that's why it was included.
Any questions on any of those items? Okay. Any other comments from the two of you before I just shift to just raise another topic, but no need to comment on it now? Any other questions related to 315?
I don't think so. As Emily provided a summary of kind of where things are at, I'm just looking through, I've sort of just said where we ended on that, the idea of, how this is going to play out from a planning process. I think we do have the immediate need to get some money out the door. You use after school as an example. I think we've all agreed that that's a good idea. But at the same time, we are at sort of this moment where we are allowing and need to allow districts to sort of do that needs assessment so that we can start to understand what the priorities are. So to a certain extent, it's premature to identify what the needs are. We can all anticipate that after school, summer school, they'll all be part of a portfolio of tools that districts will need to leverage to address the needs, pandemic needs of kids. But at the same time, we just, trying to put a pause a bit on this so that we can understand what the needs are of the districts and let those needs really inform how we move forward with identifying state level priorities.
Thank you. That's a good reminder that we did have dollars in there for truancy, mental health services, and it was recommended that, as we've been told by I believe, your staff and others, this needs assessment is being done by schools across the state and is coming back to all of you on the 15th, I believe?
Yes, the deadline is April 15th.
Okay. And these needs assessments will include things such as the truancy issue we talked about, mental health services, things like that?
Yeah, we have 3 focus areas that they're required to do a needs assessment in. One of them is social emotional learning, and that's the mental health focus area. We have another focus area on what we're calling re-engagement, which is where the truancy issue resides. And then the third domain is academics. So at this, we're looking for a broad brush needs assessment at this point, just to understand what the general patterns are, and we'll seek to refine that going forward. But I think it'll be useful at this moment in time to inform our planning, both at the local level and at the state level.
So if I may, are these going to principals or superintendents?
It's a district level needs assessment. So we required each supervisory union or supervisory district to have a recovery team. And it's that team's job to sort of organize the needs assessment. So it'll be coming from essentially the superintendents.
Okay. And you posed it as broadly as you just mentioned. Here, we know that these are needs. Tell us generally in a narrative format what those are, maybe put some numbers, but you left it to them to basically come up with explaining their needs as well as a plan, or just broad strokes in terms of their needs?
Yeah, the first step is we have a sort of a general template that we're asking them to use. Again, it's sort of like the first cut. We want to understand now kind of what the patterns of the needs. So first thing they'll do is they'll do that needs assessment, and then we will work with them to develop the priorities from that. So we have a team organized to support each supervisory union in the state. That's also the place where other state agencies will intersect, whether it be DCF or mental health. But we'll look across the state, help them identify priorities, and then through the month of April into May, they translate those priorities from their needs assessment into an actual plan, a recovery plan. And that plan is a requirement of ESSER 3. It also will be helpful to intersect with other federal dollars that they'll have on the table in the month of May, namely the title grants, which is a process that usually starts in May. So the idea is to have some basic prioritization and planning in place that can help inform and coordinate the federal dollars that are available to assist districts with this work.
Mr. Secretary, 2 things. First of all, if possible, if you wouldn't mind just sharing with Jeannie that template, if that's something, so we can.
Sure. I believe Deputy Secretary Boucher has testified on this behalf and presented the whole framework, but we're happy to make sure you have it.
Perfect.
Yep.
As long as we have, I miss seeing the template. I would like to see it.
Yep.
Secondly, do you feel as though, I mean, what you're talking about is an awful lot of work for your agency, and I just want to make sure that, you know, you all feel or have the capability to hire people when you need to hire people, shift things around. I mean, what you're describing, from where I'm sitting, that's a heavy lift, and just want to check in generally on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're very careful to situate, you know, the recovery work as being the dominant work. So, for example, we have district support teams that were organized for the federal school improvement plan under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we have already had a continuous improvement planning team structure in place at the agency. We are co-opting those teams to now support districts in the recovery process. There are areas where we do stress under this work, and the one that's probably not on your radar, which is on the radar of every state agencies right now, is a program called EANS, which is the Emergency Relief for Non-Public Schools, the independent school program. Particularly under ESSER 3, that program requires us to stand up sort of almost a direct purchasing program with each independent school. So that's going to be a little different piece of work than the sub-granting process that we normally do. So far, so good. We've stood that up. But I think in terms of the general support at this point, you know, again, the needs assessment should inform that. Another reason why we want to preserve some flexibility with the state level ESSER funds. If we do need to scale up capacity to address certain things, I want to have the funding available to do that. We are planning, and as I talk about facilities, we are planning with contracting out for some services to help districts spend their money essentially in the area of facilities improvement. We intend to use ESSER 2 funds to do that, but that's an example of us sort of anticipating the need, contracting out for additional capacity as necessary. We expect to see a needs emerge. You talk about truancy or areas of integrated service delivery models with mental health and so forth. Want to ensure we don't expend, again, our ESSER 2 set-aside funds too quickly before we know what those needs are. But so far, so good. But it's been the whole year's been like that. I mean, we've scaled up lots of programs to manage throughout the year and have done that fairly successfully so far.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, and maybe you said this and I kind of missed it, Secretary French, is that I agree with the needs assessment. I just, on the summer programs, I want to make sure that the word is getting out to programs that, you know, that their grants are going to be coming. Because I know both parents and people that run summer programs are already planning now. And if they knew there was a grant, maybe they would start, you know, figuring out who they're going to hire and find people and stuff like that. So I wouldn't want to wait too long, because of the summer programs start so quick and it takes a while just to get people to know about them, and yeah. I just don't want to miss that opportunity. But I think
it's a good point. I mean, we've been planning from the administrative side to launch a major summer school initiative, and the funding's a key part of that. You know, we're working closely with Vermont After School, DCF, and other state agencies. Today's announcement at the press conference was sort of the first step in that, was to sort of articulate from the governor's standpoint how the rest of the reopening will go through the 4th of July. We did issue some brief guidance last week to signal that school facilities would be open and available for summer programming. So we have to send some signals to the marketplace, to the businesses that are operating in this area. And we anticipate making it sort of the major unveiling on the summer school initiative on this Friday. You know, it's all part of that recovery piece, and we know time is of the essence, but it's been hard to sort of predict the future relative to the virus. We have a pretty, I think, very confident trajectory now due to the vaccination data and the supplies being confirmed on a regular basis. So we feel very comfortable that the summer will be, don't say close to normal. There's going to be some mitigation processes and so forth that are required. But the funding's a key piece. And we have to, you know, districts also have funding available. All that has to come to bear to scale up, to the extent there's student interest too. So again, the needs assessment's a critical piece.
Great, thanks. Good to hear about that you could announce that the schools will be open. Thank you.
Yeah, I think summer's on, of course, everyone's mind, and I think we'll probably have either you or someone from the agency, as well as Ms. Morehouse, back in a few weeks, just to see, as we get closer to May, what things are looking like, what might be needed, if anything, from all of us, and how things are going. So appreciate that. Anything else? Okay. You're not scheduled, I don't believe Jeannie has scheduled you for this yet, but we have, if I may just shift for a moment to the state board, and there is a back and forth around, I don't want to call it the state board miscellaneous education bill, but I think you know what I'm talking about. You know, they've got a number of things that they would like to do around powers and responsibilities. And there's conversation about the likelihood, if we could get some agreement between you and Mr. Carroll, that we would move something in a government operations bill. So I don't know if that is something that you think is something, you know, we could get to or not, but it's on our plate, and just wondering if that's something you think we could do.
Yeah, I think it is the way I think tomorrow's testimony invitation was put to me was school construction and state board.
Oh,
So, but I'm
Terrific.
happy to discuss it. From us, you know, from our standpoint, the agency standpoint, it's not about the state board. It's about what is the regulatory framework and the need to adjust the regulations. And for us, it's really you know, some observations, certainly happy to share on where we've been in the last couple of years with Act 46, Act 173, and certainly Act 77, which has been proficiency-based learning. But there, you know, the issue of construction, which we'll talk about tomorrow, there's just a number of outdated rules that need to be refreshed, shall we say. But the broader regulatory framework, from my perspective as secretary, and it's just an observation, doing this work now for a couple of years, that you know, the General Assembly made the change from commissioner to secretary for a purpose, and there's another half of that work from my perspective that needs to be examined, and that's about regulatory authority. And where we ended up last year on this topic, I think there is the state board, to its credit, coming out of the incredible work they did with Act 46, was starting to look at their, you know, what do we do next? You know, sort of a moment, if you will, existential moment for them as to what's our purpose, and really did some good work. And they were coming out of a retreat, and they started to identify updating their regulations. And then coincidentally, the sunset group that the legislature appointed to examine the purpose and trajectory of all committees was created. And the state board got caught up in that sort of examination, and that led to testimony on, you know, how to sort of defensively justify the position of the state board. But I come at it from a slightly different angle, I think, which is not so much not trying to defend or promote the role of the state board, but just to promote the idea that the regulatory structure needs more coherence in education. And we ended up in a place in this committee last year, which I would agree has sort of been a negotiation, and I would say unfairly, between myself and Chair Carroll. It's not, from my perspective, there's a logic behind it that is or isn't correct, and it's not a question of us coming to agreement and negotiating something. Like, I don't think as secretary in this temporal situation, in this moment in time, that this fundamental regulatory issue should be decided on what I think personally is the way to go. I think it's just a continuation of work that the General Assembly should embark upon at some point. It's never sort of been a front burner issue for me per se, particularly in COVID. So happy to engage in it more, but it's not about the role of the state board, though it does point to ultimately what is the role of the state board. It's more about the regulatory construct and who's accountable, what's the purpose of regulation relative to the statutory language. And I think as a state, you know, I make the observation as a long-serving educational leader in the state that we have a fairly high-quality K-12 education system. It's not because of our regulatory framework; it's almost in spite of it. So I'm interested in improving that, particularly from a perspective of quality and equity. I think that is a fundamental role for the state. And I'll touch upon it a bit tomorrow when I talk about facilities, because I think this is an area that's symptomatic of a weak regulatory structure. And I see facilities as sort of being a central precondition for an quality educational experience. And, school facilities need to be of a certain minimal quality condition if students are going to learn. And we've let that slide over the years precisely because our regulatory framework is fairly weak in that regard.
Well, I appreciate those comments and also recognize that this might not be understandably at the top of the list right now. And I'm not going to push it to be at the top of the list. If this is something where the state board and the agency feel like it's time to advance, great, we have a vehicle to do it. If this isn't the time, that's fine as well.
Yeah, and I made the observation last year, if I'll just add that what was essentially, I'll say, negotiated down, I made the comment that I'd rather stay with what we have as opposed to creating another sort of arbitrary sort of regulatory framework. I don't say arbitrary, but it's important right now, I would say, similar to the approach we took with freezing ADM last summer, to introduce some element of stability into a very uncertain financial and budgetary situation for school districts. I'm not overly excited about introducing yet another variable of change for school districts precisely at the moment when we're really trying to unpack an unprecedented pandemic. We're also trying to live under Act 46. And as you know, there are number of districts contemplating divorce or dissolution. And really the policy priority before us right now is Act 173 and special ed reform, which is totally consistent with the recovery work. So I think the regulatory piece is critical. Just not sure how do we pick this up and get it going at this moment in time. And I think it will require a lot of stakeholder engagement, which honestly, that was another piece I was dissatisfied with last year. It was really a three-way conversation between myself, the chair, and the committee. And the state board itself took little testimony on this topic, and a lot of Vermonters, I think, should weigh in on what is a critical aspect of our education system.
Okay. Any questions or comments for either Secretary French on any of these topics or Ms. Simmons? Thank you both very much. Look forward to seeing one or both of you tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it'll be me and Cassandra Ryan, who's our sort of technical expert on construction. What I'll try to do tomorrow, though, is I'm going to sort of bring together the facilities piece that's in this document I shared today with the prior testimony on construction. Again, I think construction and deferred maintenance kind of come together to a certain extent. But to what extent the General Assembly wants to leverage the one-time federal dollars that are before us, which I would strongly encourage you to consider as being the priority right now in terms of construction or improvement of facilities. I think the construction bill would need to be modified as a vehicle if that is a common goal that we share.
Okay. We'll look forward to that tomorrow. Thank you both.
Thank you. Good to see you guys. Take care.
Committee, let's come back at 3 o'clock. Welcome back to Senate Education. 3:15 Tuesday afternoon, the 6th of April. And we are going to have a walkthrough for the next, and discussion for the next 45 minutes on S-114. And just to frame this up a bit, the House took our literacy bill, added their thoughts, their ideas. You'll see that it's heavy on the grant programs in terms of the changes they suggested. There aren't as many changes in other areas. If perhaps the best way to follow is Mr. Desmarais has this on and Jeannie has this on our website. And if you look, the changes are marked in yellow. So with that, I think just a general walkthrough, but please feel free to interrupt. We won't pull it up on the screen as long as everyone has it in front of them. And then we can kind of have a conversation with Jim and see where we might land on this. Senator Hooker, you look concerned. Everything all right? You've got it? You can find it? Okay, great. Okay, great. Just want to make sure. Okay. Mr. Desmarais, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Okay. So good afternoon. For the record, Jim Damery, Les Counsel. We are looking at a side-by-side of S-114 as proposed by House Education on a straw vote, so they haven't voted this out yet, versus your S-114 as you passed it, but also with the parts that were moved into H-315. Otherwise, you wouldn't have your grant program on this page. So it's a combination of your S-114 and H-315 as passed by the Senate. So differences are in yellow. You'll see that the section numbers are not aligned because the topics are aligned. And the first topic is the purpose of the act. So what the House Education Committee has done, when I say has done, again, it's a straw vote, is they've taken your purpose. So the language in subsection A on the left-hand side is the same as your purpose on the right-hand side, except that they've added a subsection B and C. And the purpose of the B and C is to tie this more closely to ESSER funding. B basically just recites an ESSER 3 provision, which is a provision that allows ESSER 3 funds to be used to address learning loss. Okay. I won't read the whole thing, but basically this is about learning loss, and that is the category under which ESSER funds could be used for literacy. So this is a recitation in B of the language from ESSER, and then C ties that together. So C says, and on page 2, subsection C says, the purpose of the literacy grant program under section 3 of this act and the retention of an education project manager by the AOE under section 5 of this act is to carry out activities to address learning loss. So all that is just for the purpose of the argument that this is a legitimate use of funds for ESSER. The findings in section, well, again, section headings aren't going to be relevant as much, but the findings sections are identical. They're taking your findings. So A and B and C, so all the way through page 3 are your findings that they've taken. And they've added a finding of their own on page 4, subsection D. They say they have added the General Assembly recognizes that improving literacy outcomes is a significant challenge for school systems and their constituencies, and that they will require time and assistance in making necessary changes. So your findings for that one addition. You have a section 3, which amends section 2903 statute, and this is where you amended the statute which deals with reading to focus more on literacy. And this is where there's a statewide plan around this that has not been updated in years. So they did not take your section 3 because their approach, as you'll see later on, is that rather than amending this section now, they had the council that's being formed recommend back to you how this section should be amended. So they have the same type of approach, but with a different method. And then if you go to page 6 of the side-by-side.
Yeah,
I had a question, Jim.
Yep.
Where did, I can't remember that language in section 3, our section 3, where did that come from? Did we take that from AOE or, superintendents, or did somebody present that and we put it in there, or did we kind of work it?
I flagged it for you because I recognized when I saw it that the focus is not aligned with your goal.
It's not aligned with our goal.
Is that?
They not
aligned with your goal because you're focusing on literacy and this focuses on reading.
Mm-hmm.
So it was flagged for you, and so you changed it to focusing on literacy.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, the House approach is to have the council look at this and recommend back to you. Page 6 is the grant program, and this is where it's very different. So on the right-hand side is your language. You're appropriating $3 million for the purpose of providing professional development for teachers and methods of teaching literacy. That's just your provision is tailored to that kind of one area. Their grant program is very broad, if you will, and goes on for like 6 pages, 7 pages. It's a long section. So I won't take you through the whole thing word by word, but I'll give you the idea of it.
Right.
Their idea is that one or more supervisory unions, preferably more than one, coming together, will apply for a grant. What they are seeking to do is to enable, on page 7, where it says program creation and grant authorization, they want to enable SUs to adopt best practices in teaching literacy instruction to students in pre-K through grade 3. And they tie that back to Act 173. They encourage SUs to work together to apply for the grant funding. And their funding would be for three years of funding. And then there's a lot of language here as to informing, having the agency work with SUs about the availability of the grants, and how that would work in terms of who they should focus on. Then there was quite a bit of information on page 9 about what the application would have to include. So I won't go through all that language, but very detailed language about the application process. And then on page 10 about how that would be scored by AOE, and then how it would be determined by the secretary how to grant the funding. So a lot of detail as to the mechanics of this program. The way in which the awards would work is that it's $100,000 per application, and that's 3 years. So 100,000 in 2021, and then 100,000 in 2022 and 23 if the SUs are using their funds appropriately. And then really key to this bill is on page 12. So use of grant funds. It's in subsection D, and there is a shall and a may. So the shall in D1 says shall be used to establish a team to work on this, implement the applicant's action plan to improve literacy teaching outcomes. So they have to describe their action plan in the application. And so it'll be used to implement the action plan and to measure the results and outcomes. So that's the shall. And then page 13 are the mays. And they have lots of mays because their idea here is not to determine basically which methods are used, but to give options for different methods to be used, to avoid the whole conversation about reading words and what's the right way of doing it.
Well, just to clarify,
yeah,
one of the reasons we're in this problem is because people have been doing all different kinds of things. I mean, that's, I think, what we heard from Ms. Bonesteel and Ms. Myers. Are they saying it's going to be a free-for-all again? And in the end, you may or may not end up making any improvements?
Well, they have to, the three shalls have to be
Okay.
done, right? The maze, let's go through the maze. So the first one, A, is building leadership and structural leadership capacity. So improving leadership in this area. B is to implement a coaching model. And C is to implement a different form of coaching model. So there's two forms of coaching here. D is to support educators in using collaborative data systems to promote improvement. E is to provide focused training on literacy indicators and outcomes, which, if offered, shall include each of phonemic awareness, phonics, reading fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. F is to employ universal design for literacy learning, which is around scientific research on how people learn. G is to employ evidence-based structural literacy instruction, including for students at risk for dyslexia. H is to employ any other proven method that builds sustainable system-wide improvement. So those are the A's. I don't think the House Education Committee would characterize it as being like do anything. I think they would say this is a more structured, evidence-based approach.
Okay.
But that's probably for them to testify to. And then E is an evaluation reporting requirement. So every year, an applicant will have to report back as to how they're doing. And then the agency will report back to you in January as to how the whole thing went. So basically, those are the differences in terms of the grant program itself. The other is around funding.
If we could just stick on the grant program for just
Sure, yeah.
just to see if any questions. I mean, as I recall, our granting program was very much with the agency. The agency should identify areas in schools where the need might be the greatest given scores, and we put some other criteria. And so it was heavy on the agency identifying and helping and giving grants to those teachers. Those teachers would then go out and use those dollars as they'd like. They're saying, no, the supervisory unions should apply and then create something that way. And my concern in this is, well, what if it just the supervisory unions that apply are the ones who are already knocking it out of the park? And is there a way, have they gotten to a point where that won't happen? In other words, is there language there that says we really, recognize that there are districts that are doing this well, districts that aren't doing this well, and we want to focus on the districts that aren't doing it well? Is there some language there?
Yeah, so go back to page 8 on the side by side. We didn't go through this in detail, but it's here. So page 8, subdivision B says the agency in providing information and technical assistance shall focus on eligible applicants that have a relatively higher percentage of 1, students who scored over recent years lower on literacy assessments. 2, students who come from families eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Or 3, discrepancies in outcome data on literacy for students from historically underserved populations, including students who are BIPOC, ELL, and students on IEP. And that's
our language.
Huh?
That's our language.
That is your language, I think. And they use that both in terms of informing applicants, but also in assessing applicants.
Okay.
So
before we go to center lines, I'm just wondering again, why make the school districts, and this might be a question for Representative Webb, why make the school districts go through this rather than have the agency who already has identified the groups that need it just do it? Given the level of urgency.
Yeah, that's a question probably for Rep Webb, not for
Okay.
me. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Senator Lyons.
I'm trying to figure out where the plan fits in. So they've taken the plan away that we have on page 5. And so I'm trying to remember if that plan sort of wraps around the grant process. I mean, are we needing this plan before we start implementing all the grant work?
Well, the plan,
Just trying to figure out where it fits.
yeah, the plan is required by existing law, and the plan is just so people are oriented here on page 5. It says that in B, it says Board of Education in collaboration shall develop a plan for establishing a comprehensive system of services for early education in the first three grades. So the plan is in statute now. It hasn't been updated. I think testimony said since 2000 something, 2008 maybe. So both in your bill and in this bill, which we'll come on to, requires this plan to be updated. So regardless of whether you're amending the statute now or it's amended later on, if the House would do, the plan is still updated in both your bill and in their bill.
Okay, and then the next part of that, C, that's where we talk about evidence-based literacy instruction. So I'm just trying to figure out what is informing the grants process that is so fully articulated by the House. Is it the plan and the work that goes on up there on the page we were on?
I don't think so, because the House language came from a bill last year. They worked in this bill last year for a long time.
Okay.
And wrote the grant program even before they realized that this section being amended here even existed. So I don't think that connection is there.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're not putting a cart before a horse. That the grant process fits in with the other sections of the bill, the planning part. Okay.
Yeah, that's probably best left for testimony for you in terms of
Yeah.
AOE or, yeah.
Okay.
So just another point of clarification. If this again is on the districts to apply, even though they may prefer certain applicants, it is still on the districts and supervisory unions to complete the application. Is that accurate?
Yeah, supervisory unions or supervisory districts would be applying.
So one of the things we have heard a lot about is that certain supervisory unions and districts don't have people to write applications, do this kind of, filling things out, if you will. So again, what I'm worried about is the wealthier, more staffed up districts are going to apply, and then still we're going to be in the same problem. Is there language in there that would make me feel better about that, or no?
Well, the language that we went through in terms of those focusing on those districts which have higher need.
But it's still on the districts to apply, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Correct. Yeah. Sure. I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay. We're on page 15, and we're on appropriation of funds. So your appropriation was not a separate section. Your appropriation is $3 million. They have a separate section to appropriate funds. They appropriate $3,090,000. The $90,000 is for the agency in B, set aside for them to give information and technical assistance and to do evaluation. So they bumped up their appropriation by 90 to cover those two areas. And this is coming out of ESSER 3 and funded for 3 years. Page 16 goes to Agency of Education staffing. In your language as modified by appropriations, this came out of S315, you have established a limited service education programs manager position to help with the training program. And your appropriation would have come out of the 3 million. Okay. They have a separate appropriation for their, for the same person, education project manager, but they appropriate $450,000 for 3 years to fund that position. So their appropriation, if you look at it, their appropriation in total is $3,090,000 plus this $450,000, and yours is 3 million. So it's just a different number.
May I ask a quick question right there, Jim?
Yeah.
So, my understanding, and I think the committee also, was that this position would be ongoing. In other words, it wouldn't end in 3 years. Literacy is such a big issue that it would just go, it would be appropriated and then forever kind of thing.
Well, the difference here, I should have mentioned this too. The difference here is your language creates a position within AOE.
Right.
Right. And appropriations wants to make it a limited service. I think
Right.
this is how it's going, basically.
Yeah.
Their language on the left-hand side says the agency should contract with an education project manager. So it's a contract. It's not a full-time position. It's a contract. So they will outsource this whole grant program, if you will, to a contractor to develop and work on.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a conversation we'll have to have with the PROPs also to see if we can maybe get back to our original language. I just think, I for one believe in agency, somebody in the agency to do this work for the long haul is the way to go. I mean, the agency is kind of well known for contracting out. And I think sometimes that really works, but I think having a literacy coordinator, given the situation we're in, is really warranted. But that's something that we can talk to our friends in approach about. It also goes to something we can talk about before we end, but for now, please feel free to continue. I don't see.
Okay. Next is the Advisory Council on Literacy. So the changes from what you have is you have 18 members. They have 15 members.
Fine.
On page 17, on the very top of the page, there is no statewide literacy coordinator on either your bill or their bill. So they changed that to the Secretary of Education or designee. Then down to the bottom of the page, they have 7 members, and you've got 10 members serving 2-year terms. So the differences there are highlighted on the next page. So page 18, you have 4 teachers, they've got 3 teachers. And then you had 2 family members and 2 high school students. They've got 2 community members who have struggled with literacy proficiency or supported others. And you've got a Vermont Legal Aid person, and they've got somebody with expertise in working with students with dyslexia.
Do they not have any kids on this? Did they take the kids off?
No students.
They didn't think any students should be allowed to be on the committee and play a role?
I can just recount to you what I heard in committee, which is Rep. Brady, who is a teacher, said that she didn't think in this case students would be adding value. to this group.
Oh, okay.
Well, I shouldn't say adding value. That's my language. Those weren't her words, but she didn't think that was going to be an appropriate role for students in this context.
Yeah, what school does she work at?
It might be,
Okay.
she's a rep from Williston.
Oh, from Williston.
Yeah.
Yeah. She says that she believes in student involvement in lots of things,
But just
not
not this.
not this.
This is where she draws the line. Okay, just. Well, the other thing with this is I know that we were working to get young people on these committees in general, so I can, just in terms of civic education and experiences, so we can talk to the House about that. Thank you.
Yeah, they do have 2 community members with experience, right? So they put in the 2 community members who struggle with or support others. So they try and get some experience on there in a different way. Yep. So then we go on to it's all the same. My highlighting is very, very light, so I'm having trouble seeing it. But okay, on page 19, if you look down to subdivision D1, this is where they've got, it says advise the State Board of Education on how to update section 2903 of this title and the plan, see the white literacy plan. And you've got, because you've already amended section 2903, you've got how to update the literacy plan, but not the section itself. And then and 2, there's a reference in your bill to the statewide literacy coordinator at the end. That's been changed because there won't be one in either bill. That's the same. And then on page 20, this is on the powers and duties of the council. They've added number 4, which is highlighted, which is to recommend best practices for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 literacy instruction, and in order to best improve and sustain literacy proficiency. And then the report is the same. Yep. Let's see. Okay, and then they've got on page 21 in subdivision F2, there is no statewide literacy coordinator, so that person can't chair the council. So they've changed that to simply the council shall select the chair from among its members. It's the same. Okay. Yep. Then page 22. Their appropriation for the Literacy Council is $21,000 for a period of 3 years, paid for by ESSER funds. You've got $10,000 for 1 year, paid for by the general fund. And the reason why it's not $30,000 in their bill, because they cover 3 years, you cover 1, they've reduced the number of members. So that's why you got that difference as well. Then in section 8 on the left-hand side, they repeal.
But if I may, Jim, so again, they are retiring the Literacy Advisory Council after a period of time, where ours was, it was an ongoing group.
Yeah, so this was done not by House Education, but by House Appropriations.
Okay.
And I believe they have a practice now of trying to set sunsets on things so they can reconsider them in a couple of years.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that the intent, I don't think, is to make it temporary. The intent is to just revisit this.
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
And then the implementation language is different only because you've got different people on the council. So as we stagger the terms, that had an effect here. I'll go through that, but basically it's just reflecting staggered terms. So at the bottom of page 23, this is the update to the literacy plan itself that hasn't been updated in a long time. And in your bill, you've got the state board updating the plan. In their bill, they've got the agency of education updating the plan, both with the collaboration of the advisory council. And then section 11, I think the teacher preps are the same language in both. And the agency of education reports, the AOE recommended the language in their bill. So bottom of page 24, it says on or before July 1, 2021, and on or before the first day of the beginning of each fiscal year thereafter through July 1, 2022, the agency shall provide a report to you on the status of implementation and on other related topics. And then you've got a report in your bill in 21 and in 22 and 23 on progress. So basically similar, but they adopted the AOE recommended language on that. And then lastly, effective date, both on passage.
Great. So committee, I guess one question. Do you know if Ms. Bonesteel played a role in any of this? Libby Bonesteel, Jim, by any chance?
Oh, I can't remember.
Or Ms. I think for me, the big outstanding question is, again, why would we make low-income districts that don't have the resources to apply for these things, which we've heard over and over again, go through a process to apply when they just may not apply? And therefore, we might just be accommodating the more well-to-do, if you will, districts that have the resources and the people power to put together an application. So that's, I think, perhaps my biggest question for the House. And then I think I can loop back to Senator Kitchell and others on the piece about, how can we get somebody in the agency permanently? And this goes back to something, Jim, I know you've heard this committee talk a little bit about, and I don't even want to say that I'm representing the committee on this. It's more something that I'm hoping the committee might be interested in it. And that is, can we get some language, not for this bill, but perhaps a bill that we can make some use as a vehicle on auditing the agency of education? I mean, I really do feel that for me, I need a blueprint. I think others in our positions in the next X number of years need a blueprint. We have blueprints for a lot of agencies, but I just don't know, again, is it urban legend, or are we really have a problem with the agency of education in terms of staffing? And I know that if a river or a Lake Champlain were having any kind of environmental issue, somebody from DEC would be out there. But I don't get the same with the agency of education. I don't get a sense that people then head out and work on these things. Senator Lyons.
So, you bring to mind the need for a program audit.
Uh-huh.
So what are the resources available and what's being accomplished? And the reason I say that is one of my concerns continues to be the level of guidance and policy within the AOE that helps facilitate work and solutions at the local level. So part of what you're asking for, what I guess I would ask for as well, is what are some of the principles that we believe in for an AOE program? Do we want to have, because I've heard different stories every time from different members of the agency about having umbrella policies and how complete those policies are and how much is left to to the local level, as I said before. So I'm just, I like the idea of having some kind of a program audit. So what do we need to do, and who do we have there working on it? And, you know, what's our belief, or what's the system like? What's the system look like, I guess?
Yeah, we can continue to have that conversation. I think, again, for me, and I could be wrong, and this is where we'll have Representative Webben, I feel like we're slowing down the process if we're waiting for people to apply, if we're not just getting those money to people in sort of the quick way, most efficient way. We're identifying where it needs to go. The agency knows where it needs to go. Let's get those teachers trained. But we can have Representative Webben to take us through a little bit of that. Any other questions right now? Senator Perschlick.
Yeah, Jim, you said that the statewide literacy coordinator was gone in both bills. I can't remember why it was out of our bill.
It was taken out by Senate Appropriations and changed to a program manager position.
Just to lower the cost, or?
I think you have to hear from them as to the rationale, but it is a position at the AOE as opposed to a contracted position.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of contracting positions, and I feel like this is just kind of continuing AOE to go contract, let somebody go. I mean, this is where I think you need consistency and a good person. I don't know. I know the House realizes that this is a huge issue, but I think one of the things this committee and our PROPS committee wanted to do is just say, hey, let's go at this as directly and as quickly as possible. And perhaps I think Representative Webb can take us through why this whole application process has to take place, which could take a long time to get something, or longer at least, to get something going. But we'll wait to hear from her tomorrow afternoon, hopefully.